so excited for this conversation with Benny from Future Primitive. But before we get into it, I have some exciting news to share, which is that On the Other Side is joining Blockworks. So some of you may have seen this on Twitter last week, but for those of you who did not, On the Other Side is going to be joining Blockworks Podcasting Network. And if you're not familiar with Blockworks, they're a Web3 media company. They do podcasts, but they also do news and research that kind of do all of the things. And when I announced this last week, I got several messages of people being like, great, but what does this mean for the show? So I quickly want to talk about why this made sense and what it means for the show moving forward. So up until this point, the show has been a one-woman show, which means that I do, the curation of guests and recording, but it also means that I do the editing and post-production and publishing and distribution. And I also have a full-time job in crypto, which I love doing. One of the things that I think is most important for me personally as a content creator, if that's what you want to call me, I think that's kind of an awkward term, but as someone who makes a podcast, is I love being in the weeds and being able to run into the problems in the DAO ecosystem and Web3 more broadly, and then bring that point of view to the show. And that's always been very important for me. And so one of the things that I didn't want to do is go full-time podcast or full-time content creator. But what that means is that I need help. And Blockworks is just about the best partner that I could have. So not only are they at the forefront of what I think media should look like in Web3, but they are also incredible producers of podcasts. They just do all of the things. So basically, full transparency, what is happening in the back, how the sausage is made basically, is that I have the full autonomy to choose guests, to talk about whatever we want to talk about. Blockworks produces the podcast, so they do all of the editing and all of that stuff, making sure everything sounds and looks good. And then they also are doing ad sponsorship stuff, which I'm also very bad at, and a little bit of distribution as well. So really, Blockworks is taking on the logistical stuff that I'm very bad at, so that I can focus on having exciting conversations with guests and engaging with listeners and doing all the things that I'm actually very excited about doing. So that's why it made sense. What it means moving forward is more consistency, because I've been really, really bad about publishing every week, just as a one-woman show and, someone who has also a full-time job in crypto and does other things. It's not always the easiest to put out an episode every single week. And two, it means video. So if you're listening, we officially now have video for the pod. So there will be a YouTube link in the show notes. You can go check that out and subscribe on YouTube. And then if you are watching, congratulations, you found YouTube. Thank you. And so I think the main takeaway here is just more consistency, more sustainability, and hopefully support that will make sure that the podcast can continue on for years and years instead of my sporadic posting whenever I can get my shit together. So yeah, this is definitely something that I'm really, really excited about. And also I want to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without you, people who are listening, people who have shared the show and supported Gitcoin grants. I really can't tell you how grateful I am. Making this show is truly my pride and joy. It's something that I absolutely fucking love doing, and none of this would be possible without you. So thank you. I'm so excited to continue making the show. I'm excited to be able to focus on making it a show that I'm super excited about and not have to worry about all of the other random shit that I am not good at handling, like producing the show. So yeah, that's kind of what's changing. And I, again, just want to say thank you so much. I'll stop talking now so that we can hop into the show, but thank you. And I'm so excited for what's coming. I am here with Benny Giang, who's the co-founder of Future Primitive. Benny, I'm very excited to have you on the pod. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, Chase, this is awesome to be on this podcast. I've been a long-term listener, and now I finally get to be here with you and chat about all sorts of things. So awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, I can't wait to chat about what you've been working on. I feel like it's bubbling up on Twitter a little bit, so I'm very excited to dive into it. But before we even go there, maybe you can give a little bit of background on you, how you fell down the crypto rabbit hole. You've been doing some really incredible work in crypto for the last few years. So would love a little bit of background on all of that.
Yeah, so my journey started, I think nearly 6, 7 years ago, I was a social media intern at a venture studio called Axiom Zen here in Vancouver, Canada. And this venture studio was very interesting. They actually were tech agnostic, so they were working on enterprise SaaS. I started off working on some VR live streaming apps, location-based dating apps, mobile games, and one project that we ended up working on, me and my good friend Arthur, was called Toby, Toby, and it was a Chrome extension that helps you manage your browser tabs. So I think to date, nearly 400,000 users are using it every single day. So we were working on that, and something inside of this venture studio, Axiom Zen, started to bubble up, and it was like, oh, look, there's this thing called the blockchain and Ethereum, and this is around like 2016. And at that time, all the headlines that I saw, and yesterday was the Bitcoin Pizza Day. So that was the first headline I saw. I was like, what? Someone bought pizza with Bitcoin? And that sounds weird. And then there were ICOs happening, people writing white papers. And I was, to be honest, in the beginning, very turned off about the crypto thing. And I was like, I'm here to live the lean startup life, the Silicon Valley dream, to build a startup and ARR, reoccurring revenue. Like, what is this crypto stuff? Like, it's not even, it's all speculation. But as we were working on Toby, me and Arthur, inside of Axiom Zen, there was a project that was related to cats. And this project, it was started by a few folks like Mac and Dieter and Fabiano, but they actually iceboxed it. Inside of the venture studio, they actually wanted to build like more enterprise blockchain solutions, like real estate on the blockchain, decentralized IDs. And the thing is, the studio didn't really have a reputation for crypto, right? They weren't in the space since 2014 or something like that. So they're like, well, we need like a toy project that we can launch in a weekend and just learn Solidity and contribute back to Ethereum. So they called on me and Arthur to revive this project from the icebox, and form the team inside of the studio. And then we launched the alpha version of CryptoKitties. And then we went to ETH Waterloo. That's when I first met Vitalik. And yeah, the rest is history, So after CryptoKitties launched, it blew up. We spun out, we formed Dapper Labs. And then I kind of stuck around for the last 6, 7 years, working on Cheese Wizards and then working on NBA Top Shot, leading one of the product teams there. And so that's kind of been my journey. And then sometime around October 2021, I decided that the company grew to about 650 employees. When I started, I was number 13. So it was massive. And I really miss this experimentation, this space of what are NFTs, and asking those hard questions. So I decided to leave Dapper Labs and form Future Primitive with my co-founder, Steve Giang, who's based in the Bay Area. And the whole purpose of Future Primitive is to build technologies, launch startups, launch projects for decentralized communities. And so we like to call ourselves an on-chain product studio.
I absolutely love that. And I'm really excited to dive into some of the stuff that you're working on at Future Primitive. But also, I think it's fascinating that you have worked on some of the most popular crypto applications to date. I think, for people who have come into the space over the last year or two, they probably have heard about CryptoKitties, but maybe it's just worth taking a moment to acknowledge how big of a fucking deal CryptoKitties was. Maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of the meteoric rise of CryptoKitties in the 2017 era, and then we can dive into some of the protocol aspects that ended up bringing you about too.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So I always love telling the CryptoKitties story. In that period of time, 2016 to early 2018, there was a token standard ERC-20 that was launched, right? And ERC-20 allowed for a lot of amazing things. So one of which was fundraising for new projects, right? And so there have been a lot of legitimate great projects like IPFS, the Brave browser with their BAT tokens. And so you're able to launch tokens and generate and raise a lot of capital. And you had a alternative future of, instead of going to VCs where you dilute equity and go through that whole path, you can launch a token and then raise a lot of money and build your company that way, right? But as if anything, there's always like a good and there's a negative side. And so people also saw opportunities of like, well, this is crazy. I could just launch tokens. Or what if I just write a white paper about like, I want to build a new Uber, but for decentralized networks, and then launch like a coin and then people can invest. So that became the ICO era, right? The initial coin offering. And I think that started to take up a lot of the headlines, right? Like every single week, there's a new ICO. There's a lot of like activity on the pumping. Telegram groups started going crazy. But I think amidst that kind of like extremely noisy in foggy period, there were a small group of people who believed in the technology, they believed in the blockchain, and they were actually builders. So they wanted to build things on top of this ecosystem. And so CryptoKitties kind of like struck a heartstring with those folks, because we were at ETH Waterloo. That was the first ETH Global Hackathon. And at that event, like we launched CryptoKitty, and like I had these Pokemon cards that had stickers on the back of them, and I was handing them out to people in Waterloo. We had cat balloons and everything. And I think what it did was it invoked like an excitement of like, oh wow, like because a lot of people were building wallets at that time. The MetaMask team was there. So people were like, oh, I'm working on a wallet. And there was like, I don't know, like 30, 40 projects doing that. And then there were other folks like launching ICO tokens inside of the ETH Waterloo event. And I think what had happened is that people had this shared thought of like, why can't we build something that's actually fun and engaging, that teaches people like something else beyond just ICOing? And at that event, we actually had a huge lineup. Like I think we had 30 people line up at our hackathon table, all asking us, bringing their computers and like, yo, how do I breed my kitties together? Because you can. And so and this funny thing is like we hooked into there was like a Slack group for the hackathon. And then people were in there chatting like, yo, I just bred with this guy's kitty, and like making jokes. And we had like for breeding, like an eggplant emoji and a peach emoji, it was kind of like mostly for fun. But I think that excitement and like, wow, we got so many people to set up MetaMask, people getting like testnet, Rinkeby testnet ETH, that it really like gathered and garnered like attention, right? That was the complete opposite of like this whole ICO wave. After that, Waterloo, like all the other big major crypto events, people were like gathering up in small little groups and like breeding with each other's kitties, because that was like super fun to do. So that's kind of how that whole thing started with CryptoKitties.
Yeah, and I think like, of course, there are some things to pull on around how CryptoKitties kind of created that little like emergent community early on. But also CryptoKitties, I think, was sort of at the forefront of a new type of standard, which was 721. And something that I think is really fascinating there is just, and we can dive into, the EIP process and things like ERC standards and what those things are. But I think what I find fascinating about the approach there and your approach that you're taking now, which we'll talk about in a little bit with 6551, is this idea that like consumer experiences can shape the protocol itself, or the standards at least that we have on these protocols. And so maybe it's worth giving a little bit of context on ERC 721 and how CryptoKitties sort of push some of that forward. And maybe also defining what ERC and EIP actually mean for people who aren't familiar with that.
Absolutely. So ERC 721, A lot of people like, why is it that number 721? Well, it's the 721th proposal for an EIP stands for Ethereum Improvement Proposal, because Ethereum is decentralized. The community has the right to propose things that can if ultimately affect the ecosystem. And so, part of that process is submitting like a proposal, which we did, and it ended up being the 721. And ERC-20 is the 20th proposal, and then ERC 1155 is so on and so forth. So 721 was a standard that we created as a team at CryptoKitties and at Dapper Labs, and the general idea of it was that with the launch of tokens like ICOs, ERC-20s, every token was the same. If I was to create a Chase token or a Benny token, they'd be all the same. They're fungible. But when we started to think about like our experiment, which was CryptoKitties, we didn't want them to be all the same. We actually ran like a genetic simulation, and we knew that we wanted the tokens to have genetics. And there was like a concept of like the sire and the dame, and the breeding mechanic would mix in, and we'd create a new kitty. And so it wouldn't make sense to adhere to like, make all the tokens the same. So that's where we created that standard that allowed for like, hey, what if every token was unique? And we named it non-fungible tokens, or NFTs. And that became the kind of the polar opposite of these fungible tokens that are super cool still. And then we have like, hey, how do we envision art on the blockchain where images and metadata are unique to the token? So that's where 721 came from. And we launched that standard along with CryptoKitties. And, there are, I think part of this, as you mentioned, Chase, it's really important to think about standards and consumer experiences and then primitives, right? They all kind of like, for us, at least for me, over the last 6-7 years, they are all circular. They play into each other. The definition of a new standard is super powerful because it's like an open source commitment to leveling up the entire ecosystem, which NFTs did. Introductions of new ideas that can be shared by the broader Ethereum community. And then the second thing is like, well, it's not enough to just like have an idea and write a proposal, right? We actually want people to click buttons and to smile and have a fun time. And they may not even know about all the complicated things like the standard and all that. That's okay. As long as they have fun breeding kitties, they are actually interacting with the 721 standard. And then the third thing is thinking about like the primitives, right? Like how does this primitive now of like breeding digital cats, how does that open up like the whole ecosystem of blockchain games? And that was like a big thing in 2018, 2019, this blockchain game side, which is still kind of running now, but that's kind of like the circular motion.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. So you would define a primitive as sort of a something where it's like laying the groundwork, setting an example for what other people can then either, fork or at least draw inspiration from.
Yeah, primitive, it's a kind of a big word, but there's infrastructure required there. There's open source tooling, there's SDKs, there's like, a bunch of other things, while a standard is just like, it's like in music, right? Like the jazz standard by Thelonious Monk, right? Like that's a jazz standard, and but that's not enough because you got to actually use the standard to play the song, and then the primitive is like the publishing and like the whole infrastructure for other people to experiment with.
Okay, for also people who aren't super familiar with the way that standards on Ethereum work more broadly, because I think this is a good distinction to make. So ERCs are a standard, right? Mm-hmm. But EIPs are the proposal of that standard. Can you walk through that just a little bit so that people are familiar with the terminology in that system?
Yeah. So when you submit a proposal, it starts off as an EIP, Ethereum Improvement Proposal. And the EIP goes through many phases like draft mode, and then review, and then then it goes to mainnet. And it really varies. Some standards, they get merged in with like a huge protocol update. Some of them just become mainnet and they're like they're official, but they may not actually. There's a lot of ERCs that have made it to mainnet but has no real like users or no real projects use it, right? And so EIP, that's what it stands for. ERC is Ethereum Request for Comment. And so an EIP changes into an ERC once the proposal is written. And it's in draft mode. And then there's something called the Ethereum Magicians Forum, where that's where everyone is supposed to comment and provide feedback and provide their opinions. And the whole idea is that it encourages, everyone to contribute and for everyone to weigh in. And if there are people who are strongly opposed, they can say anything they want on the Ethereum Magicians Forum. Once that's kind of like gathered momentum, you could submit the EIP for review. And then when you submit for review, there's a whole Ethereum cat herders. There's like a whole committee that's part of the foundation, and they take a look at it and they review it. They look at all the comments. They kind of weigh in on whether or not the proposal has achieved enough consensus. It has enough momentum. Is there people using it already? Is there one comment on the Ethereum Magicians Forum, or is there like hundreds? And so they have their own rubric system. And once they think it's legit, it's good, then they could kind of stamp it. And that's when it becomes an ERC. And then, eventually gets merged. So that's kind of how that whole process works.
Mm. And when you say it gets merged, like what does that actually mean?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So it is, in some ways, it's a stamp of approval which states that this thing has achieved enough consensus, and so this is now an official standard. But that's pretty much all it really does mean. It does not mean like, oh, this is a standard and there are 10,000 projects using this standard, right? Some standards, they get stamped, but they never get used, so they kind of just like sit there, right? Some projects get rejected. You could get rejected if there are a lot of things, but if you copied somebody else's ERC, or you did something that's like mischievous, like when the review committee goes through it, they can decide like, hey, no, like you have to change this thing, you have to edit it, or they could decline it, or they can stamp it, right?
Yeah.
And when it's stamped, that means other protocols or platforms or wallets, it's like for them, it's like, okay, this thing is solidified now and we can adopt it if we want, but we don't have to, right?
Right, because really like ERCs are not happening at the protocol level. They're not changes to Ethereum themselves, right? They're just sort of standards around specific types of smart contracts like tokens or non-fungible tokens, or as we'll talk about in a minute, token bound accounts. So it's really like everyone agrees that this standard, or at least generally enough people agree that this will be a standard that we use when doing certain types of things on chain. And that also probably makes composability easier as well. So like OpenSea optimally is using the same NFT standards as Blur and everyone else.
That's right. Now, the caveat is some of these standards actually do get merged on a protocol change. It's the surface area of proposals are really wide. Some of them, like 6551 or 4337, they are like 4337 just got stamped, so it's like legit, it's on mainnet. But they're not affecting protocol, but there are ERCs that do affect protocol, and those ones, after they get stamped, they are set in like there's like a long period before they're like merged into the protocol.
Gotcha. Okay, so really EIPs and ERCs can be any type of improvement proposal, whether it's at the protocol layer or at the standards layer.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. I feel like we have a good amount of foundation now. So going back to 6551, which is the ERC that you have been working on and thinking about. Maybe we can sort of, when I think about the experience with CryptoKitties and saying, okay, we know we want to breed, we know we want each individual kitty to have their own sort of genetic makeup, and we know we want them to be able to come together and create new types of kitties. And so thus ERC 721 and the NFT standard was born. To me, that's like, okay, cool. I understand that problem space and I see where ERC 721 fit into that. Can you talk about the problem space that sort of prompted your thinking, your and the team's thinking around 6551?
Yeah, so 6551, it's a very interesting one. So again, the way we arrived at it was we've been working on this project called Stapleverse with Jeff Staple. And Jeff Staple has been in the streetwear fashion space for the last 25 years. He has his own brand called Staple Pigeon. And we decided to team up about a year and a half ago. And we're like, you know what? Let's reimagine like the future of storytelling and streetwear and fashion, all these things. So we ended up working together. We launched a bunch of really cool NFTs, and the latest collection is called Sapiens. And the focus of Sapiens is it starts with a hypothesis of like, why is it that PFPs or profile picture projects, like why are they like wearing the same clothes forever? Like if you get a Azuki or a Doodle, like you're stuck with it forever. And so from that hypothesis, we were like, well, what if we launched a PFP that looked super cool and you could change your outfits 10 times a day, 20 times a day, right? Because that is a natural expression of who you are. And being a profile picture, you have a distribution through the profile picture that's on Twitter and Instagram, everywhere. So through that thread, we started to think about, okay, well, there's been a few experiments in around this digital fashion space, Artifact being one of them, and a few others like 10KTF. And all of them have been really fascinating. They've been kind of cutting edge, first ones to go, but they also revealed a lot of, challenges with digital fashion, right? Where like if you have a crypto kick and you put a vial in there, people can't really tell if the vial's in there or not, and then people sell the shoe and they eject the vial, or by putting the vial into the shoe, you got to pay gas. And so through that like thinking process, we were like, well, like how do we get to the point where people can change their outfits as many times as they want without paying gas, but also be fully on chain? Because it's really important for us that like when you're a builder and you want to start to get a little bit more creative and complicated with like NFTs, you really have two choices. You go off chain and you kind of raise a lot of money, you hire a lot of devs, you build a whole backend system, right? Or you go on chain, and in on chain, there are complexities there that really hinder like what you can do with an NFT. So through that process, like we started to think about, what we can do. And I think the actual aha moment was when we were in ETH San Francisco. We were at the hackathon, and we were working on a project with Billionaire Boys Club, another streetwear brand, and we were launching this thing called the Beepers. They're like a 90s pager device, NFT. And the whole idea is like, what if each NFT can talk to each NFT using decentralized messaging like XMTP? And at that point, you still needed a MetaMask to own a beeper. And then once you did that, your MetaMask can reroute messages to other beeper devices in that collection. And after we became one of the finalists of ETH San Francisco, we went for like breakfast the next day, and me, Jaden, and the team were like, that was super cool, but what else can we do with NFTs? And that's when the light bulb popped. It was like, well, what if NFTs had their own wallets? And then if they have their own wallets, then they can talk to each other rather without the MetaMask. And then if they had their own wallets, they could own a digital hoodie or a digital t-shirt. And so that's kind of where we arrived at that like thought process of, okay, well, I think NFTs need their own wallet. And then we went down the rabbit hole of like searching through like many ERC proposals or other projects. So like, has this been built yet? What has been the different approaches? And so in summer, ERC-6551, we're giving every NFT its own smart contract account or its own wallet. This is already live. All the NFTs right now on Ethereum mainnet, from CryptoKitties all the way to the latest NFT project, they have their own account address, so they can actually hold any other token. So that's kind of been the genesis of 6551.
Yeah. And I love that it came out of a place of actually building a real consumer experience. But I think when you and I had a conversation about this a while back, I started to sort of begin to grasp what this means. And I want to try to recapture that aha moment, because it sounds like, oh yeah, okay, like NFTs now have their own accounts. But I think when you really start to think about what this means in practice, at least my head kind of explodes. So you have this like lovely, very simple name for this, which is token bound accounts. And basically what that means in my head is any asset that I have that is an NFT can now sort of like create a world of its own, which I think is really powerful. So maybe you can talk a little bit about like breaking down just token bound accounts. You kind of already did, but thinking about an example of like, okay, what does this mean in practice outside of maybe a very specific like game context, and thinking more broadly about what this means and starting to open the Pandora's box a little bit.
Yeah, I'll start off with the name token bound accounts, which is the name that we reference is linked to the NFTs. And so the reason why it's called token bound accounts is it's the exact inverse of a soul bound token, right? Soul bound tokens, you have a wallet and the tokens are in there. You can't transfer them out. Token bound means that the token is bounded to an account, right? So sometimes we call it TBAs, but that's kind of how the name came from. And so, yeah, I think the really interesting thing is there's another ERC called 4337 account abstraction. Essentially, it's this imagination of like, well, Ethereum has reached a point where there are quite a lot of users, but there still doesn't have like the entire world. And the way to really improve that is through the onboarding. And so with 4337, the whole idea is like, how do we reimagine onboarding? Like right now, people got to download a MetaMask wallet or something like that, save a seed word, private keys, all these things. But Vitalik and a bunch of people from the Ethereum Foundation were like, no, like it can't be like seed words, private keys forever. It's never going to work. And so the best way to think about what we're doing is we're prescribing a 4337 wallet or an account to every single NFT. So everything that Vitalik and the foundation have been thinking about through better onboarding, that is kind of like packaged up with every single NFT. Now, going into like let's zoom out a little bit to 10,000 foot of like, what's the purpose of this? Like, so what an NFT has a wallet? What can you do with this? Why do we need this, right? So from a 10,000 foot perspective, there's this thought that I've been thinking about quite recently is that I really do believe that these digital worlds we're constructing are really awesome. Sometimes people call them metaverses or autonomous worlds or whatever. But the biggest problem with these worlds or metaverses is that there's an empty world problem, right? That no one really hangs out in these worlds. You typically like ghost towns or dead malls, right? Maybe you have an event and everyone kind of comes into like this digital metaverse and then they all leave and then it's quiet, tumbleweed and everything. And so the kind of like philosophical exploration is, how are we going to populate these empty worlds? How are we going to kind of give life to these worlds that make it exciting and, both from us as humans and AI or, whatever it is. And so the thought process is when we give an NFT a token bound account, we're giving it two properties that are really important. One property is the ability to own assets. So now an NFT can own other assets. It could hold onto ETH. It could hold USDC. It could hold Pepe coins. It could hold other NFTs. The second property that token bound accounts give to NFTs is social governance. So now that an NFT has its own account address, it could be a signer on a multi-sig. It could have its own ENS subdomain. It could participate in voting on proposals. Right now, it's like humans using our MetaMask to sign transactions, right? Or whatever wallet you use. But an NFT can now have those properties. It's like giving an NFT a passport. And now they can open up a bank account and now they can vote, right? And I think that's the first step of like giving that NFTs the ability to operate, sometimes mentioned as an agent or as its like own identity, right? We have this concept called NPCs. And NPCs, for a really long time in games, they serve a purpose, right? Like if you play any games, imagine there were no like characters to talk to, like in Zelda, like there's nobody there, it would be a very boring game. That's why they have NPCs, non-player characters that give you storylines and quests and things to do. And our imagination of that is something called networked playable characters, NPCs as well. And we think that NFTs will evolve to that standpoint where now an NFT could have its own account, it could vote, it can have its own monies. It could also, if we add AI in there, it could have a personality, it could be tweeting, and it could also execute on-chain actions as well. And then it starts to create these NPCs that populate these empty worlds. So that's kind of like the high level 10,000 foot of like, why this all matters.
Yeah. And I think what's really like fascinating about this to me is that in today's model, you generally assume that like someone doing something with an NFT or even voting on like governance proposals, selling ETH, whatever, there's kind of like an assumption there that it's an individual. It can be a multi-sig, like there are other instances. But I think what becomes interesting here is it's like an abstraction above our like very like rudimentary idea of identity that we have today, where now on-chain actions and an entity on-chain is no longer mapping one-to-one with an address that is like a wallet, but instead with like this NFT as an asset. So you and I could, for example, co-own an NFT, which actually has, a ton of governance power in some specific organization, which is also true for a multi-sig if we were to use it as that. But there's a lack of shared identity in a multi-sig that you're actually creating in this token bound account that I think is really, really fascinating. And it kind of makes me wonder if some of this stuff will kind of make us I'm sure it will, but I'm curious in what ways. How it will make us rethink and reshape our concept of identity more broadly. I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I believe in a lot is like when we're thinking about consumer products and about just human psychology, I believe that we as a person already have different facets of personalities or identities, right? Like whether or not you're hanging out with your high school friends or your new professional friends in Web3 or your cousins, from your mom's side, like there's different facets of you that you operate already, right? When you're on crypto Twitter, like you want to flex and you want to, write memes and stuff like that. And then you may have like an Instagram where it's like your personal life or like selfie photos of yourself. So we already kind of live in this multifaceted identity reality, right? And I think that NFTs since the beginning, now more so with like the imagination with 6551 and token bound accounts, is that you can really assume those identities through a visual aspect of like, oh, I'm Azuki123 or I'm a Doodles 551 today, and then tomorrow maybe I'm a Bored Ape 123. 122, right? And the fact that they have their own accounts, you can actually log in to all sorts of dApps like Uniswap or OpenSea or Rarible. You could log in as your NFT, and then you could participate and take in actions. You can talk to other NFTs. That's coming very soon, where it's like because before, if I wanted to talk to you on chain, you would need an ENS name. Otherwise, I don't know what your address is. But not everyone has an ENS address. So it kind of breaks that like social component. But what will happen in the future is entire NFT collections will have ENS subdomain names. So everyone's like token ID, name of the project .eth. And so I could just message them fully on chain. And there's already there's a picture there, right? That is more better than just 0x something, right? So I think this is a natural progression of, I think, humans, for us to interact with each other, for us to interface on the internet. And it just so happens that it has a really cute picture, but it doesn't really have to be. You can actually sign in as like a piece of NFT art or a digital t-shirt or digital, like the Unisocks. You could log in as a Unisoc and do some Uniswap trading, right? I mean, it gets kind of wild. It doesn't have to be a PFP, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it also to me marks this progression of like, I think today, if you read into identity in Web3, a lot of our identity is based on what we own. And so I think from that perspective, it feels like this is a progression into going from identifying with what we own into identifying with the actual individual things, almost identifying as the things that we own in a way. And in my head, I'm like, oh, it would be fascinating if I use a very specific NFT of mine for like random governance stuff and another one and sort of assume these different identities. I guess one question for you is, there's a lot of conversation around, the DSO paper and soulbound tokens and what this means for privacy and all of that stuff. I'd assume that if I'm showing up as, I don't have an Azuki, but let's just assume that I do for the example here. If I am showing up as an Azuki and people are going, okay, cool, that's how we message, that's how this person interacts with governance, that's traceable back, right, to like a core address where people can then see my other identities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you still need a wallet to own the NFT.
Right.
And so you still need a MetaMask or Rainbow, or the NFT could be in a Gnosis safe, right? Or a ledger, right? So, there's still a string that's tied from the original wallet that owns the NFT that has a token bound account. That being said, there is a concept called stealth addresses that Vitalik has written about. And the whole point of that is to initiate from like the MetaMask. You need a private, you need a EOA wallet to initiate different stealth addresses that can own the NFT. So there's some shielding that could happen there. You could also use something like Aztec to kind of like send the NFT in there and then be able to kind of like mix it up. But yeah, there are probably some early solutions of like this whole identity as Azuki123, like there's no traceability to like an EOA wallet, which it links to you. The only challenge is going to be, how does the token bound account acquire ETH, right? Because it still needs ETH to make actions or pay gas. And that's kind of like the big question mark, right? Because at some point you're going to have to go to an exchange or swap, or even if your friend sends you ETH, right? There's your friend probably has a Coinbase account. So it's less about like the camouflaging of the addresses. It's more going to be about how do we get ETH into the NFT, right?
Yeah. And I guess, Top Shot had an interesting approach here, but that was different, I guess, because it was not on Ethereum. It's funny because it feels like we're slowly chipping away at some of these onboarding problems. And we're still left with some core like questions. one of them being to the point about ETH, like, how do you make this accessible for everyone? Which I think kind of goes back to this question around, or this idea around, like, we're going from identifying with the things that we own to identifying as the things that we own. Something that always comes up on this podcast is like the financialization of everything and what it means to, if I were to identify with the car that I drive, which I live in New York City, so I don't drive a car, but at one point in my life I did. That would definitely be like an odd choice for me, but that is something that I own and that I guess I do have some part of my identity tied to. And so I'm curious in that context, how you think about, what it means to create these types of worlds where we are identifying with like assets that we are purchasing with, ETH. And what does that mean for how we show up in these spaces?
Yeah, I think the core of that question assumes that a human is in the center of that loop. I think that, like, I'm very fascinated by things like Dunbar's number, where a human can really have like 150 meaningful relationships throughout a human's life. And I think there some concept we've been thinking about is like, is there such thing with assets owned by humans? Right? Is there a Dunbar's number for how many actual objects can you actually have meaning and is there an actual number that is scientific and proven, right? But one thing that is true is that I'm sure, like in your home or in your apartments, you may not have you're not prescribed like like the clock behind you, or like there's things in your home you're just like, if it breaks or if I sell it, I don't really care. And I think that it's the same case for like NFTs, right? Like NFTs or digital objects. Not all of the things you may care about. Some of the things you may care a lot about. The things you care a lot about, maybe you want to take even further, where you could become it, you could interact with it, you can use it. Other NFTs, like maybe some open editions, you're just like, meh, like, I just collected it. I don't really care for it. I think that's where it's going to be interesting, because I guess the question to ponder is whether those objects that you don't care too much about, whether or not you would like to prescribe some sort of AI to it, where then you're like kind of like, all right, this digital clock that NFT that I don't really care much about. How about it already has a token bound account. How about I just link it up with some sort of AI thing, and then just let it run loose inside of like a metaverse, right? Like this crazy clock has a personality and chases people so that they're on time in the metaverse. I think things like that could be interesting, but it just comes down to like, just like in real life, maybe realistically, there might be 3 or 5 NFTs you care a lot about and that you want to assume the identity of. And then the rest of it is just like, well, it either sits here or I'd set it loose into have it populate these empty worlds and live its life, live its best life.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Do you imagine there are going to be some, like, I'm curious if you imagine really odd use cases for these like NPC type of assets. Like you mentioned the clock. I'm curious what other types of automations you imagine in these types of worlds. And do you think they'll be like businesses as in and of themselves? Like, do you think that people will pay the clock to make sure that they're on time and you have this weird little, NFT that actually is running like an autonomous business that you own?
I really do think so. I mean, it's kind of crazy to imagine. We'll recircle this topic in 5 years, and then we'll see how the future played out. But I like one thought that I had for a while now that's a little bit more grounded rather than like a crazy clock in the metaverse that's owned by Chase is thinking about self-driving cars, right? Like I think Tesla has this vision where the if you own a Tesla, that eventually you can actually rent it out, and it'll drive itself out of the part of your garage, and then other people can borrow it and use it, and then it returns back in your garage, and you make some money out of it, right? So in these kind of systems, something like the Tesla car, it needs to charge itself, right? It needs to get more power into itself. And so what really happens is if we prescribe some concept of a wallet or an account to inanimate objects, could be NFTs, could be a robot, could be a Tesla car. The Tesla car can actually drive itself to a charging port, and based on the money that it received from the last person it drove, can actually pay the electric charging station itself from its own wallet, and then charge itself, and then kind of self-sustain itself in its whole network, right? And so take that into the clock, right? Like maybe the clock is serving a fun purpose, or maybe is actually like doing under the hood, it's like a MEV searcher, and it's like optimizing transactions, but it has a personality. Maybe it shit talks on Twitter while it's like, haha, I beat you in this MEV transaction. And so it's doing on-chain actions by itself. It has its own token bound account. Maybe it's making its own money. Which is kind of hard to grasp. And it really gets into this territory of like, are we in Black Mirror, or like, is this like reality? But I think it could be used for all sorts of purposes, and hopefully for fun. And we get to go into these Alice in the Wonderland where like all these crazy NFTs like are talking to us and doing weird things.
How far away from some of that automation do you think we actually are? Because some of these things need to be like initiated, of course, by some external party. Like lots of smart contracts are not actually automated because of the way that Ethereum is designed and all that stuff.
I think we are probably months out. I think all the pieces are there. And in fact, I put out a tweet. I'm hoping to organize an event called NPC Day. And that's where we would gather like AI with 6551, 4337 with NFTs, and like basically like all the Lego blocks are there. It's just it hasn't been stitched together yet. And so for NPC Day, which we haven't found a date yet, but I think we could launch an NPC in the next few months that we put some ETH in it and then just let it run wild on the blockchain, and maybe has its own Twitter account and all of that.
It's interesting also because if you start to think about these as like little autonomous accounts that can actually do things on their own, the other fascinating part about token bound accounts is the idea that they're tradable. So I can, set up my Azuki can have this like little MEV business that it makes a ton of money off of. And I can go, you know what? I don't really want to like deal with this anymore for whatever reason. Maybe it's costing me to do some specific thing. I'm going to sell this account to Benny, and, I'll sell it for 2.5 times, the annual recurring revenue. For Benny, that makes sense as an investment. I get to exit. I think the MEV opportunities are actually like going to shit. Like, it's kind of interesting because they almost start to become little entities that we also can own and trade, which in the context of that bot is one use case, but you could also see a world in which I build up an entire identity as, a DAO contributor, and in a much darker sense, I sell it to you, and you can then go and, show up in all of these different spaces as if you are some incredible DAO contributor.
Welcome to the Matrix. Exactly that. You could even have an NFT. So, we know there are bots on the blockchain, right? There are bots that do MEV, that do all sorts of things. And so that already exists. And what token bound account does, or what NFT does, like that gives a visual representation of the bot. And then the last component is the AI component, which gives the personality of this bot, right? So now the bot has a job it could perform that's on chain. It has its own account, it has a visual, and then it has an AI. And so those are like pretty much like all the pieces, the infinity stones for it to basically operate, right? But you could even have an NPC that's like watching it's a bot or it's an NPC, so it watches all the NFT art pieces and it kind of evaluates data on like which art pieces is culturally significant as NFTs, and it acquires art pieces and sells art pieces and becomes a whole art trader. And then that can be paired up with an NFT like I don't know, like a Milady, right? So it's like a Milady art trader curator, and every piece that's Milady buys, it like posts it on Twitter and be like, "Yo, check it out." So these things are gonna happen very very soon in the coming months, and there are like a lot of philosophical, humanity, psychological questions we must ask ourselves, like, is this good or is this bad? But I think it's gonna happen regardless.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest source of uncertainty around some of the philosophical questions is for you? Like, what keeps you up at night with regards to this stuff?
Yeah, so I think the negative sides is like, what are we know we're on this kind of side of like creating all these digital worlds and in these metaverses or autonomous worlds, but a lot of it is trying to like mimic real life. And these NPCs populating them could be cool, but I think there are like potential consequences too that could come from this, right? Where things get out of hand and the NPCs go like have a riot or something, they take over these digital worlds. So I think like there is fear of like linking all these things could actually create something that we may not want. And yeah, that's kind of what keeps me up at night, right? Because from 6 years ago, we were all about, hey, let's just put digital art on the blockchain, right? And let's just make it you could buy, sell, trade JPEGs. Like, isn't that awesome? Because obviously JPEGs, you don't make money from it, right? But now we're like in this new territory of like, oh, it's not just an image, a JPEG. Now I think the term NFTs are like becoming its own thing, because before like we had NFTs and everyone just say, oh, this is JPEG that you can buy, sell, trade, right? It didn't really it was kind of pretty much the same, but with token bound accounts, NFTs are no longer a JPEG. Like it's like a thing now. It's an agent. It's an identity, and that kind of mode of thinking is going to take a little bit for people to like, whoa, galaxy brain into that concept, right?
Yeah, totally. I think anytime that we give computers the agency to do something that we would usually only be able to do, it is both a huge unlock and a massive holy shit moment. And I feel like that's what I'm starting to have around token bound accounts. Before we wrap, I would love, you mentioned like the populating these digital worlds with NPCs, and all of that stuff. In like an optimal utopia, what is your vision for token bound accounts as we close this conversation out?
Yeah, I'd love to see, like, there's so much creative play space. I'm really excited to see there's already a few projects building with token bound accounts, ERC-6551. There was a project that had a Chrome extension that had this little cute bunny on the bottom of right corner that hangs out, and like it's kind of like Clippy, but like new version. And it has its own wallet, and you could poke it and play with it. And I was like, yo, that's pretty sick. So I think the what really excites me is like the builders, the people who have new creative ideas. I think it's going to unleash a new wave of NFTs that are really thinking about like, oh, NFTs are much more than 10K PFPs. They can be so much more. So I'm just excited to see the space build using it. And they can, ERC-6551 is out there to be, people can contribute and comment. And then tokenbound.org is the website for people to plug in their NFTs and see what their addresses are.
I would highly recommend checking out Token Bound because it's got a very cool visualization as well of everything that we talked about, which I feel like is probably helpful for people because this is some of it's abstract and some of it's not, but it's really cool because it's all actually live and you can start playing with it. But Benny, I so appreciate you coming on the show. This was a fascinating conversation. Where can people, you mentioned Token Bound, but where can people learn more about you, the work that you're doing, 6551, all of the things?
Yeah, so on Twitter, ERC-6551. There's also at Future Primitive. My handle is just my full name, Benny Giang. I tweet a lot of random thoughts there, so that's probably an area to follow. And yeah, that's kind of where we hang out. Tokenbound.org is the website. Future Primitives, futureprimitive.xyz.
Beautiful. Benny, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so fun.
Thank you so much, Chase, for having me here. This was awesome. Time flew by. It doesn't even feel like an hour.
I know. We might have to do a part 2.
Absolutely. When we launch NPCs, right?
Yes. There we go. Thanks so much.